right, guys, spinnerbaits. What a simple bait, but there's so many more things you can do with these things. Of course, you can throw them out, turn the handle, and catch a muskie, but these are the Swiss Army knife of muskie fishing. If you want to learn more about spinnerbaits and how to catch more muskies, we're about to dive into it. So, a couple things you need to look at with spinnerbaits is the build of the bait. Not all spinnerbaits are created equal. There's some intrinsic things in how these are constructed, as simple as it might be, that really affect their performance. If you take the short arm of a Joe Bucher Slop Master or the long arm frame of, say, a figure 8 Steve's Meat Grinder, two different baits. They accomplish the same thing catching muskies, but they can do different things. It doesn't matter what brand you fish. Let's delve into some of the things that you can do. At the end of this, though, I'm going to show you some cool mods to get more out of your spinnerbait. So I'm pairing my spinnerbaits up with a Musky Shop Shield rod. This is a 9/6 heavy action. The heavy action's plenty hook setting power and allows me to have, a little bit of flexibility on the cast. I've got a Tranks on here today, but any reel's going to work, especially in the later season. Your slower gear reels will work really well. But in the summer, stick with 6/3 to 1 or the high gear option. So let's talk about some of the cool things you can do with these things. Again, of course, throw it out, turn the handle, muskie on in, right? Everybody can do it. You can buzz them. You can do all these different things. Where spinnerbaits get interesting are their applications outside of just straight retrieving. So this Joe Bucher Slop Master, right? I'm going to flip over here. We've got a vegetative edge here, littoral zone. We're up in a little bit of cabbage, nothing too thick. But during later parts of the year, we're going to fish some really thick stuff. So like the Slop Master design. Why does this stand out? The small frame and the small body. These small hair bodies seem to really stand out high pressure waters, but in shallow settings. This is going to grab a heck of a lot less vegetation when we're throwing up here. So of course, the classic throw it out, reel it in methodology is going to work. Something you do with these small spinnerbaits that's dynamic, especially on pressure waters. Throw this guy out and start looking for the pockets and edges, right? If you see, I'm going to drop this bait. Every time I see a hole in the weed bed, drop it down, slack line. What's happening is this spinnerbait's falling, it's still working. Unlike a bucktail, bucktails, obviously they catch muskies. You have to keep turning the handle for that thing to really do anything. On a spinnerbait, as we bring it around, you reel it in, you can let them helicopter down. So that's probably one of the things that most people overlook. You go, well, if I'm not turning the handle, how's the muskie gonna eat it? My bucktails, if I stop, nothing happens. Spinnerbaits with their blades, they helicopter down. So pickpocketing, in thick cover. We designed this. I work with the guys at Figure 8. This is an exclusive at the Musky Shop. This is called Steve's Meat Grinder. This is designed specifically for big fish and specifically for heavy vegetation. Our bucktails are not going to be really applicable in really thick stuff. So how do we get big thump and we pickpocket? So back to that technique, right? We're not going to just turn the handle here. I'm in my wife's river rig today, so I'm going to get used to the old school trolling motor here. Picking pockets with these things. Steve's Meat Grinder, throw it out. I'm visually looking for voids. I'm not looking for fish right now. I'm looking for a void. Okay, there's a void in the weeds. Let that thing helicopter down. Pick it back up, right? A lot of times, if I have a big hole in a weed bed, I'll reel, let it fall, then pop up. Let it helicopter back down. If you see, there's not a lot of advancement in that rod. Muskies, especially in the peak summertime, peak Canada fishing, you'll see this void in a weed bed. You might throw a bucktail there, you might throw a topwater, but we can't move him. But your instincts, everything you know about muskie patterning says, there's a muskie in there. This is super dynamic to pitch that guy out, right? Again, we'll reel to a void in the weeds, right? Straight retrieving, get into that void. Let it fall. It's going to fall straight down. Let it fall. Jig it up. Let it fall back down. Jig it up. If I'm taking my rod angle in an upward manner, it's advanced far less, obviously, than ripping it. We'll get to that in a minute. But that straight vertical jig motion will allow that bait to at least rip out of the pocket and come back down. Rip out of the pocket and come back down. It is super deadly for reluctant muskies. Now, something else about kind of drop shotting, or however you want to call this, yo-yoing in some capacity with these baits on a weed edge or a weed bed, looking for the pockets. If I'm retrieving a spinnerbait in heavy cabbage, right, and I'm coming through here, I'm grinding the weeds, hence the name, Steve's Meat Grinder. I'm grinding through these weeds, right? This bait is just kind of kicking through here. It's coming through a weed bed. I can feel it coming through here. But I get to the outer edge, right? I haven't caught a fish yet. Haven't had action yet. Letting it fall. Get to the outer edge. Let that bait dead stick down on the outside edge. Now, we're dealing with hot muskies. You had some follows and some action earlier. You know, if the fish are hot and they're eating, not something I'm going to do. But a lot of times, high bright sun, dead flat calm like we have today, we need to get creative. So, spinner baits like the Slop Master, a Grim Reaper, the Steve's Meat Grinder on the outside edge of that weed bed, right? So, you know, one good retrieve. Let's say I got this pocket over here. Reel it. I'm in the pocket. Rip it up. Let it fall. Rip it up. Let it fall. Okay, nothing yet, right? Coming outside of the weed bed. Get to the outside edge of that weed bed, the very edge of it. Rip it up. Let it fall. Rip it up. Let it fall. Then obviously coming back in, completing a cast, a straight retrieve, and a figure eight. But you can't do that with a bucktail. You just simply can't. You simply can't do that with a bucktail. So that jigging motion is something that's unique for pulling fish out during tough conditions. You know, in a weed bed, these same techniques work on rocks or any kind of other cover. You can do that in timber. But perennially, spinnerbaits excel in weed beds. You know, with the design of the Steve's Meat Grinder, a different take of the weedless thing, we've done a lot of different things and modifications to this bait to allow it to run as weed-free and foul-free as possible. But that means you can be confident when we're hitting those voids in a weed bed or hitting that outside edge. Something else I love to do with the Slop Master Steve's Meat Grinder, maybe it's a Rad Dog or, you know, a Dick Pearson's grinder, is the lateral edge in a unique way. You hear a lot about guys talking about spinnerbait trolling. You know, Steve Herbeck's an advocate for that. I've written about it. Joe Bucher's done it for years. We'll talk about some spinnerbait trolling in a second, but you can accomplish the same thing as a caster. So we got this weed edge. I know the outside edge is somewhere here, right? Throwing that bait out and literally yo-yoing the same fashion on that outside edge. We're making this enticing presentation that's just ripping on the outside edge. You can kind of contour that. That's kind of a guidey cast. You know, you'll see Bucher, he's always fishing this angle and that angle if you had people in the boat with him. But not being afraid to actually do a follow-up pass of a casting pass on that extreme outside edge in a lateral fashion, right? So muskies will, and they do stage on the outside edges of weed beds quite a bit. So keeping more hang time, more bang time, if you will, on that outside edge is important if we've patterned them to an outside edge. The only way we can do that in really tough conditions are techniques like this. They're not going to go for the burn. Another thing about spinnerbaits, yes, it's a blade bait. It's got a body. Who cares? You know, bucktail spinnerbait, if you treat it like your bucktails, you're going to get the same results. You're not getting everything you can get out of these baits. So we've got the pickpocket routine. Say with a meat grinder, pull him in here, fall in the pocket, rip him up a little bit, fall in the pocket, rip him up, right? We can do that same thing to re-idiate. We get to the outside wedge of the weed bed, nothing's happened yet. Do it again, right? In the lateral cast. Okay? What can really be dynamic about a spinnerbait outside of those elements is the control of running depth, right? We'll talk about it when we get to the shop later, is the blade composition and how it influences running depth with a spinnerbait. Where, you know, this is Steve's Tailgater from Figure 8. It's a Colorado blade, but let's say you're a Bucher tail owner and that's fine. Colorado blades, they're going to run higher in the water column than your willow leaf blades and a few other factors. So the versatility of spinnerbaits to control your running depth. Like I said, I'll cover all the different blades and how they influence it. But spinnerbaits are the ultimate straight retrieve bait for depth control, right? Outside of augmenting our bucktails, you know, if we're throwing a straight retrieve bucktail, say a Bucher tail or a Mayhem or whatever it is, you know, little bit of this, a little bit of that. Because the lift of those blades, you have to add a bit of weight to really get your running depth where you want it, where spinnerbaits tend to respond way better to rod angle, right? So let's say we're getting follows. We're in a scenario here, hey, we're on the water. We can't just call the pros at the Musky Shop. We're out in the boat. They're not going to deliver bait on the water, but they'll deliver it to your house. But you're on the water and you got to make a change. How can we convert some more fish? Say we're in the situation, weed edge, timber edge, whatever. We're doing our routine. We're just straight retrieving these guys. They're coming in. They're breaking off 10, 15 feet for the boat. They're breaking off. They're not doing what we want them to do. The spinnerbait routine is going to allow you to keep these fish down. Light angle means so much in musky fishing. So the speed control and the depth control of a spinnerbait is going to be far greater than your standard bucktail, single or double bladed. You know, so in that scenario, if I have fish that are breaking off before they're coming in the figure eight, you know, I can simply really adjust my rod angle, rod tip in the water. You can do that with, you know, bucktail as well. But you're gonna hold that depth even in a slower retrieve, right? So I need to get it down there and keep it there. These single-bladed spinner baits, they're so much easier to keep at super sluggish pace, you know, opposed to a bucktail. You gotta keep it rotating on that shaft. Just the composition of these things make them deadly versatile for cold front conditions and make them very versatile when we need to slow things down. Again, we'll talk about blades and how they affect that. So, when am I going to pick a spinnerbait over a bucktail? If muskies are moving on bucktails, it's peak season, or they're buried in cabbage or somewhere that's not really that accessible. You know, back to the weed-free nature of these things. You put a bucktail through a thick weed bed, you might get the follow, but once the blades stop, you're in trouble, right? Every now and again you might get to eat, but we're not going to get too many of them. So relying on them in thick cover is something that's super important. So we talked about picking pockets, we talked about jigging the outside edge. Maybe we're structure fishing, right? We're fishing a structural edge that is devoid of weeds. It's not in the littoral zone, it's just a point. If we're aware that muskies are holding deep, they're on smaller presentations, right? How are we going to get a small profile down deep in a culprit? Spinner baits, right? So obviously, say we're fishing a deep point. Throwing that bait out there, your sink rate's great, and then jigging, similar to your weed bed, calling it yo-yo. You can fish this bait at any depth the entire time. Even when I'm not reeling, this bait, this Steve's tailgater, it is working, right? So if I need to fish a point in, say, a river system or a river point, a lake point, doesn't matter. I can get this bait down there, create a jigging action via yo-yoing, right? Or simply on a rate of fall and contour that structure, right? That's going to be hard to do with a bucktail. So quickly, I start thinking about the versatility of structure fishing with spinnerbaits, right? When we think deep and we think big action, as muskie anglers, we think big rubber. At times, muskies don't want that big of a target. Think about cold fronts. What are we told to do? We got to downsize and we got to slow down. Spinnerbaits like the Steve's tailgater, your meat grinder, your buku tail, they allow that speed and depth control. Don't think of them as this straight retrieve bucktail alternative. These baits are not for your girlfriend or your cousin Eddie that can't fish and you're afraid he can't keep a MEPS going, so you put him on a spinnerbait. That's what everybody does, right? They go, well, he's going to screw up a bucktail. He can't keep the blades turned, put him on my spinnerbait, and we kind of lose sight of how valuable these can be. So in a point situation, like I said, throwing this guy out and yo-yoing, we can contour down a point. Right? We can start at the shallow end of a point if I'm directly on this point and yo-yo down that thing the entire time. So that bait is hopping, right? Everybody loves fishing tubes, loves fishing krakens. What do? They hop and they fall. They hop and they fall. So when I work with Don at Figure 8 on the tailgater, which is exclusive to the Musky Shop, I said, I want a spinner bait that is a pull pause bait as much as I want a straight retrieve bait, as far as I want anything else. This is a jigging bait. So I can contour down this point the entire time, finish that thing off with a flourish, you know, your figure eight to work it back. What I like about spinner baits in tough conditions is that jigging nature and different things we can do. So say we're fishing the point, we're fishing a hard edge, right? Maybe we're fishing, you know, a straight vertical drop off in the fall and they're moving on big rubber, but you can't get them. But back to the jigging nature of this thing. And the versatility of it, and this could be your slop master, it doesn't matter. The ability that we have to do different things. So, you know, if I'm fishing a hard drop-off, vertical ledge, we've been ripping big rubber, we're seeing them on Panoptics, or we're getting the follows and we're having the action. I can do the same thing outside of a yo-yo. So like a Steve tailgater. I'm not afraid to throw this bait out straight, right? You look at baits like the heli dog and a lot of modifications that other great guides have come up with over the years for big rubber. It's the addition of a blade. So if we're in a scenario where rubber's not working, or we need something to downsize, to counter rubber, a spinnerbait is a premium option. Now, a lot of things you can do there. You can dress these with a bigger profile piece of rubber if you want, or a big sassy shad, but this is a really quick option for rip, pull, pause bites that just aren't clicking, okay? So being of the mindset that we can get more action out of this bait. Now, with the tailgater, I fish quite a bit of shallow water. And I started working with the slop masters and working on some of these baits. But with this bait in particular, what we've done is we've added a rear blade. And it's not because of having a flashy rear blade. A lot of time went into the right blade combo to allow this bait to suspend better in a jigging falling motion. So as it rips forward, this blade catches water and slows the fall, right? So if we want a quicker fall in a jigging spinner bait, you know, your slop master, it doesn't have a rear blade, or your Steve's meat grinder, you know, they don't have the rear blade, so it was going to fall a little quicker. Now blade speed, back to that, your willow leaf, less surface area, we'll talk about in a minute. But it is an option for you. But with the tailgater, I fish a tremendous amount of shallow water. For river anglers, you're fishing a lot of snaggy stuff. A bait like this, instead of ripping rubber, it's going to be about the weed-free, snag-freest, easiest bait for you to fish, where you can make bottom contact and those single hooks are not getting hung up. So working this as a pull pause bait is pretty deadly, right? Now, just like any other rubber or any other pull pause bait, I'm going to try to do something unique on the figure eight. So with like Steve's tailgater, if I'm getting close to the bait, I'm just going to just straight retrieve. And just like I'm fishing any blade or any spinnerbait, right? So I can mix it up in that regard and kind of close the deal on a straight retrieve if I've moved a muskie, say off of that vertical edge, you know, we're fishing parallel to that, or countering with my big rubber presentations as something unique. Again, the versatility of spinnerbaits just is never ending. It is truly the Swiss Army knife of muskie fishing, because having a pull pause bait that'll work in, you know, super shallow East Coast rivers or super timbery stuff where you can get it in there where the muskies are is really going to pay dividends. You know, outside of using it as jerk bait, outside of using it in a yo-yo technique off the boat, or picking pockets, you can start your vertical jigging career with these things as well. They are deadly, deadly, deadly. Just right off the bottom in channels, shallow rivers, you know, fishing a big bait like a Bondi sometimes is not the option. Blades with a Colorado blade really helicopter down, you know, like the Joe Booker Slop Master, the Steve's Tailgater in particular. It becomes a really versatile vertical jig. You know, I've had many a times fishing Bondi baits where they're swiping at it, they're hitting it, and I'm just not getting the connection. Dressing these out, you can put a little more rubber on it if you want, or just straight up with the tailgater, boat side, letting her fall. It's a slower fall, right? So if I'm off the bottom, a way slower fall, more suspension to it, right? Now, the another cool thing about spinnerbaits that gets overlooked so much, and this is stealing from Booker, right? Let's go to his bait real quick. And you can do this with any spinnerbait. Now here's the small hair version of the Slop Master. You know, we'll talk about mods, but right here, you got straight wire. You can do so much with these baits. If you need to augment the running depth of these baits or keep them in play all day long, rubber course sinkers, anything you want to do here, you can get weight on these baits really fast. So if you need more running depth, you know, whether it be rubber course sinkers or a bell sinker that snaps on, however you want to get weight on these, it's not going to be a problem. Guys, this is so important to your muskie game. You might have started here. Don't give up on spinnerbaits. Add them to your muskie game. You're going to catch more fish. Trust me. Those are a couple techniques to get you going. We're going to go back to the lab. We're going to go back to the house and show you a couple cool mods, a couple different things you can do to get more out of your spinnerbaits and how to keep them maintained. All right, guys, spinnerbaits. I showed you some different tactics you can get more out of these baits with on the water, but there's some modifications we can do and some tweaks to get even more out of spinnerbaits. Something that keeps me super excited about these is their ability to morph with our seasonality. What do we need on the water? We can get them out of spinnerbaits of any frame size. It doesn't have to be a Steve's Meat Grinder or a Joe Booker bait. You can use these same mods and the same tactics I showed you on the boat, whether it be figure eight, whether it be Rad Dog or Ace Baits. Any spinnerbait platform for work. You can pick them up at the Musky Shop. One thing you need to be looking at to get the most out of your spinnerbaits is the lure parts and components section of the Musky Shop. So here we have so many different blades. Let me get this up. Here's a big Colorado blade. I've got a willow leaf blade there and a French. These are some of your typical blades here. So you've got Colorado, that's a big number 10, an Indiana, which is fluted, a French blade, which is more flat but has this cup design to it, and your willow leaf style. Each of these blades has a different rate of spin and lift, okay, based upon surface area. So a number 10 Colorado blade is going to spin slower, if you will, than a French blade, but have a tremendous more amount of lift because of surface area, right? So you're going to get a bigger thump and more lift out of this bait. So let's say, applying that, we want to take a Booker Slop Master and get a ton of thump out of it and basically get this thing to bulge on the surface at a slower rate of speed but bigger action. You can take this double 10 or single 10 from the Musky Shop Parts and Components, switch it on your split ring. Now you have a single 10 blade on here. So blade modifications are super easy. Most of the time, all you're going to need is a pair of split ring pliers. Some companies like Figure It, they actually have a snap here. You can change the blades in and out. So having a selection of these from the Musky Shop in your boat is highly, highly, highly useful. Where we'll get on the water and you get on a bite, and let's say all you have in your boat is you've got one of these and one of these, right? So you've got two baits. You've got a Steve's Meat Grinder, a Joe Booker Slop Master here. And you get on this willow leaf bite. Well, you can augment this bait to get the same kind of deal out of it. Switching the blades. So all you need is a couple blades instead of this litany of spinnerbaits. As a guide, this is something I've been doing for eons, where you have a handful of baits and you've got to get the most out of them. So swapping the blades is going to change the game. You know, a quick rule of thumb, and I'll lay them out here. So a Colorado blade, regardless of size, by the way, this is a number 10, but an 8, if we do a direct comparison of an 8 Indiana versus an 8 Colorado, the Colorado's always going to have more lift due to their cup nature and their surface area. So as far as lift goes and running in the water column, your Colorado's going to be the shallowest, followed by your Indiana, followed by your French, followed by your willow and your French debatably. There's not too many really large French blades on the market, but the willow and the French are going to run deeper than your Colorado and your Indiana blades. Now, the French blade tends to spin faster, and the willow leaf spins a little bit faster as far as revolutions. If we took a foot of water, how many revolutions as we're moving that bait is that blade spinning? Where a Colorado has a slower lope, it takes longer to revolve, right? This nature, than the willow leaf. So these are faster spins, less lift in the water column. So they're deeper running, where these are shallower with more lift. So if you're in a situation where you're really moving some fish, but they're breaking off by the boat or they're coming in a little deeper than you want, make some quick augmentations of the bait. It takes 5 seconds. You need to take this Slop Master, take off the split ring right here and swap the blade and see what happens. A lot of times that's going to open up some magical possibilities for you. And again, having a selection of blades on hand for your spinnerbait mods is very handy if you just have a handful of baits. You don't need a whole Lakewood full of spinnerbaits of every variation when you can just have a small parts and components box and get so much out of these baits. So blade augmentation is super easy. Now, something that's really cool with spinnerbaits is they retain their seasonal usefulness. You can apply these from season opener till the ice up, right? Most people think spinnerbaits is a summer slop bait. What I like about spinnerbaits is their speed and depth control. We've talked about that. On the boat, we talked about the versatility. We can rip these baits. We can hop them. We can jig them. There's so many things we can do. But something that's overlooked with spinnerbaits is another mod that we can do to increase or decrease their profile, right? We hear all the time, well, Muskies are on smaller baits, right? They're hitting downsized presentations, or they're hitting magnum presentations, right? Spinnerbaits can be modded and changed up a little bit to increase or decrease that profile. Something as simple as removing the grub off of a bait is going to decrease the profile substantially, right? We can decrease the profile of that bait by removing the grub, because when it's in the water and this bait is stretched out, we're losing 4 inches of profile immediately, just the removal of the grub. We've downsized that bait. So if we're getting follows, I've seen it happen numerous times. We're getting follows on spinnerbaits. Well, what do we do next? We need to downsize, or we need to do something of that nature. Well, just the removal of the grub will close that distance at times, right? So just something as simple as that. What excites me even more is upsizing with spinnerbaits. A lot of times we're in positions where the cover is just so gnarly. There's too much timber, there's too much rock, there's too much slump for us to, say, throw a Poseidon in there with rear riding hooks or bottom riding hooks or something of that nature. So taking spinnerbaits as a platform to get more out of your musky fishing is so easy. So first of all, I'm going to remove this hook, and I'll cover hook replacement here in a second, but you know, something that's just ridiculously easy to upsize a spinnerbait presentation for colder water or bigger fish. And if you're in a bad situation, get your hands on big grubs, right? You can get your hands on, this is like a Lunker City, but you can, whether it be a big sassy shad style body from the Musky Shop or anything, come in here, thread him on just like you would a grub, bam, right? I'll show you some trailer hook stuff here in a minute. But threading this giant swim bait body onto this figure 8 bait, now I have a paddle tail with a blade in front of it that is going to be pretty much snag free. Obviously we can check our trailer hook here, dress him out here, and thread this bait on here. So now we have a really well hooked, large profile spinnerbait. And you go, okay, I'm not seeing that very often. It works as a great follow-up to your swim bait presentations. If I have one guy that say he's having action on a swimming dog, or we're getting follows, doing this has closed the deal for me so many times. And again, if I'm fishing timber, rocks, really tough cover, super shallow stuff, the top of a Canadian reef, and these fish are on swim baits, you can throw that in, it ain't getting snagged. It's coming out of there clean every time. So this is a great follow-up, again, for winter applications. Super slow presentation. This big grub body, throwing it out, letting it fall. You got an undulating tail and a slow falling blade. It's deadly as a follow-up for your jerkbait bulldogs, your krakens, and your medusas. As a great follow-up cast back in the coldest of conditions. Like I said, spinnerbaits don't have to be the continual chuck and burn. You're getting very little out of these baits if that's all you're doing with them, okay? So we can upsize something else. You know, you can even take a bait like this, and this is just something I grabbed. You can up the profile, where this is a replacement skirt from Maps for their bucktails, right? Boom, put him on there. Now you have a big marabou skirt, and we've increased the profile dramatically. So going from a stock figure 8 spinnerbait, you know, the Steve's Meat Grinder has a big oversized magnum. I can't remember, I think it's a 7 stock. You could take just this frame, right? You buy this, you buy the Booker bait, and you can do so much with this. Like I said, you can do the grub. You can augment it with a replacement MEP skirt. Something as sneaky as these little white pre-tied bucktail skirts we sell at the Musky Shop. You can put them on there. Now, that opens the question of how do we properly put a trailer hook on a spinnerbait, right? So if we're doing all these augmentations, you're out there in the boat and fooling with this, you'll notice most manufacturers, when they have a spinnerbait with a trailer hook, right, like figure 8 baits, comes with a secondary hook on it. Some of the Booker stuff doesn't, some of it does. And that's systemic of the fact that this is to be like super sloppy, right? He doesn't want this to catch in any weeds. So you can add a secondary hook to this if you wish, but some baits come with them, some don't. You'll see that it has this little plastic tensioner, if you will, hook retainer, you know, just this piece of stiff plastic they put on there, and it cannot come off. That rear hook can't get off of there, right? Well, if we're modding baits, that's got to go, right? That's got to go. So we'll take our handy dandy cutters here, try to cut this guy, but now we have removed that hook, right? So, you know, with this bait, say it came off here, now we have any platform, anything we want to do here. So this hook, so let's say that we want to switch it out to something as simple as just a white grub, right? Maybe our grub got trashed. We just caught a nice fish and our grub's destroyed. Okay, take your grub, thread him on there. How do I quickly get this hook back on, and what's the best methodology? So we don't have the little hook tensioner or little plastic thing on the boat. Those aren't very handy dandy. There's a couple ways. Something that's pretty traditional is this is just tubing for a fish tank, right? It's not expensive, it's super easy to work with. You take this stuff, cut a small section of it off, mash it over this eye, all right? Try to get that in the shot. I'm just forcing it on there, okay? Then we're going to take that, center it, and feed it through that hook. And it actually takes a good bit of force there. That trailer hook is now not gonna pop off there, right? It takes a good bit, right? It's not going to, in a typical typical fishing situation, come off. So it's a pretty solid methodology, right? But there's a couple other ways to do this, especially if I'm playing with baits. If I'm out on the water, I'm trying to get dialed in and I want to know, hey, what can I do with my spinnerbaits to get more out of them? What can I do to make this thing work even better for my applications? This is kind of a bush fix of craziness, but it works. Let's say I've threaded this on, I'm replacing a grub or putting one of those MEP skirts on or a bucktail skirt on the river spinnerbait. Get this guy on here. I'm gonna play with it. I'm gonna take a zip tie, and I keep tons of these in the boat. Zip tie it up, tighten it, clip off the excess. It's going nowhere, right? Small little zip ties. That's not going to prevent you from hooking a fish. It's not gonna get in the way. It's modular, it's movable, right? But I can clip that on, clip that off in 2 seconds, right? Preferably I use tiny clear ones, but for the purpose of the video, I used a larger zip tie here so you can see the example thereof. But they make very small clear zip ties. They're very handy for modding spinnerbaits really quick. So anyway, that's a couple ways you can upsize, downsize that profile, right? Something else that's of note with spinnerbaits is their shelf life. Most of these are just skirted or threaded on. So I have spinnerbaits I've ran for 8, 9, 10 years where I've just had to replace the skirting material. So at a certain point, this will get frayed, whether it be hair, whether it be plastic. You know, it's either threaded on or it's zip tied on. You can just take your clippers, remove the zip tie, and now you have a new platform to put any skirt you want on there, or you just remove the threading here, and now we have a spinnerbait frame that's still completely usable. You can grab yourself some Flashaboo from the Musky Shop or deer hair or whatever you want to tie on there. Doesn't have to be pretty, or you can make something magnificent, but out of the parts and pieces at the shop, there's so many options. Just take a spinnerbait head and sort of build the spinnerbait of your dreams there. One other thing I would mention as far as modifications, let's say that we've got this Steve's meat grinder. Now let's grab the Slop Master. Let's say we're fishing the Slop Master. And, you know, earlier in the morning, we were getting some fish moving. They're coming up shallow on this thing. We're chugging him, blah, 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 blah. Here with this shallow cover. Maybe we got a bite. We had some action. And things slacking off because the fish are coming in just a smidge deeper. They still want this bait. They're still falling, but they won't act because it's running a little too high, but we've still got engagement. Quick change-ups on your weighting of the same bait. I would say the easiest way to modify a spinnerbait is a rubber core sinker. Now, I've already opened this guy up. When you get a rubber core sinker, it's pretty tight, you know, small slit in the side. And the original intent is you feed your line through here and then put the rubber insert in, and that retains this on your monofilament or your braid. For spinnerbaits, I simply take a flathead screwdriver, open this up. I can apply that to the arm of the spinnerbait, right? And with a quick little press of a vice grip, I've added, you know, a 1/4 ounce, 1/2 ounce, an ounce, whatever you want to my spinnerbait in just a couple of seconds, right? So this is not gonna pop off while casting, just that tight little grab with the vice grips, tighten this up completely. So I've augmented that bait's running depth dramatically, right? So if we need the same configuration, but a deeper running depth, just a rubber core sinker crushed on the front of this guy's gonna do great. Something I've done in the past just to have handy is you can have trailer hooks that are pre-made up here. So I can open this up, have this already on the trailer hook, ready to go, right? And then I just change it out as needed. So I have a little group of these put together where I've got 1/4 ounce trailer hooks, I've got ounce trailer hooks, I've got all these different trailer hooks that are pre-weighted for quick mods on the water, hence the zip tie application. So I can just grab a pre-weighted trailer hook, boom, 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 it's on. Under a minute, I've added the weights to this. I didn't have to bend this guy open because it's already taken care of me on the boat. And that's super dramatic for spinnerbait trolling. On the video, we touched on it just for a second, but there's a slight art to it, but most of it's just throwing the bait behind the boat and letting it run, right? A good bomb cast and you're just trolling along here and you usually get the job done, but we end up doing the running depth equation. What is our blade configuration? What's the overall weight of the bait? Having trailer hooks pre-weighted for your spinnerbaits ready to go, you know, with the rubber cord, gonna make that trolling far more simpler. It'll also help you tremendously when you're just casting these things and you're trying to get dialed in on a bite. Guys, there's tons more you can do with spinnerbaits. There's so much more. I barely scratched the surface of all the fun things you can do with these things, the way you can get more bites out of them. But, you know, stuff like this from Figure 8 that comes basically pre-modded, the Steve's tailgater with the rear blade for jigging like we talked about, or the Slop Master stuff, the Figure 8 stuff, the Ace baits, all of them. Great baits. Pick your spinnerbait, do some modifications to it. It's a Swiss Army knife of musky fishing, and you're gonna put more muskies in your net.